And then they say, you live down here, and they point to the far, far, far end of this hourglass, one half of the hourglass shape, way, way at the end. They were like, that's the Milky Way. That's your home. And then we were just there. We had taken all of this time to leave, to come out, to go past all this beautiful stuff. It was just for my benefit. It was just for me to see all of this and take it in. We could have just been out to that center as quickly as we wanted to, because now we were suddenly just back in the solar system looking at Earth. There was just no time at all. And I was like, oh, wow, that was quick. We went all that distance. They're like, yeah, it's easy.
Hello, thank you for tuning in. My name is Nella, and welcome to my podcast, Ethereality. Today's guest is Lindsey Scharmyn. One thing I love about this story is that she had a near-death-like experience without having a trauma to her body. When she was around 16 years old, she had an amazing and beautiful journey pulled out of her body and traveling through the cosmos so far out that she was able to see the entire universe. And out there, she gained so much amazing insight from seeing the universe at large and the spirits that were with her. And if that experience isn't fascinating in itself, her journey back was just as mind-blowing. And I'm very excited for her to share this story with you. Thank you so much, Lindsey, for being here. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about your near-death-like experience?
Yes, this was about when I was 16 years old or so. I was asleep, and for a while, I thought this was a very exceptionally weird, and I didn't even have the language to say lucid, but lucid dream. But it wasn't, but I didn't know that. And so in the experience, I left my body and I left my room, and I was with some guides, and I didn't know that word either. I just knew that I was with something that felt very safe, protective, wise, and really beautiful. And a couple of them. What's really interesting too is I just didn't really ever see them full on. They're always right behind me. I just knew that they were right behind me. I could turn and I could talk to them, and I still didn't really have an idea of who it was. It actually took me much of my life to figure out who it was. So that part didn't kind of come through as easily, but they took me into what I perceived to be a ship, and we floated out of the world. We floated out of Earth. And it was super exciting for me because I love beauty. I love nature. I was very science minded. I was very materialist minded. So the idea of being able to see the planet and be able to see the cosmos and see all of this was really beautiful to me. And so I was just like a little kid in a candy store, and I was like super excited. And I was like, oh, look at this. Oh, and look at that. Oh, and look at this. And, they seem to be showing me everything on purpose so that I got to have that experience and really celebrate the beauty of the universe. And I saw the sun, and I saw Mars, and I saw Jupiter, and I saw everything. And we're going through the solar system, and I'm just like, this is so cool. I've never seen it in a movie. I've never seen it. You don't see it, right? You can see pictures in National Geographic sometimes, maybe. And so this was super exciting. And the walls of the ship were basically all windows. They were all transparent. There was no real walls there unless you didn't want to look out. And I was talking to the guides, and then it would seem like walls. And then if I turn back around to look, they would just disappear, and there would just be nothing between you and space, is what it looked like and felt like to me. There's still some kind of a barrier I could go up to and sort of like be at this window, but it didn't even look like a window. It just looked like nothing. All of the beauty of the solar system is all around. And then we leave the solar system. And then I'm really excited. I'm like, well, what's past the solar system? And they're like, there's these galaxies and there's those galaxies. And I was seeing spinning nebula and like clouds of dust that are going to form into stars and other suns. And all of these things are beautiful and overwhelming. And we go farther and farther, and I'm just not even concerned with how far away we are, where we're going, what we're doing. I'm just like lost in the experience of how gorgeous everything is. And again, I feel very safe and very protected. And so I'm just not even concerned at all. And we go so far that now we're out. It's very sparse. It's very dark. There's not a lot around us anymore. We had gone through all of these planets and nebula and all these things. And now we were in sort of a space of not that. That was still there in the distance, but there was just sort of nothing. And then we sort of turned at some point, and they said, look at this. And I looked, and it was just this blazingly brilliant, beautiful, cluster, super cluster, giganto cluster of light. And I just thought it was one light at first. I thought it was just one indescribably large sun or something, because I could see all those little specks of galaxies we had gone by, and they were tiny, and this was huge. And I was just pressed up against the non-window, non-glass right at this point, and I was like, what is that? I just can still feel it. It was just like pulling me, like I just wanted to just rush into it and be with it. And I knew at that moment, I felt at that moment, this is home. That's the word that it appeared to me. That's the feeling that I felt when I was looking at it. And it's still even emotional because that is home. And that's how I understood it. And they said to me, this is the center of all things. And I saw then like what was coming out from that center. And on either side of the center was this hourglass infinity shape, sort of clusters of all that we had come through, right? All of the galaxies, all the nebulae, all of the spirals, all of the things were coming out from that center in like one half of an hourglass on either side. And they perfectly mirrored each other. And I could see that they were rotating too in opposite directions, right? All of that stuff that was coming out of there was all rotating around it in this hourglass shape. And so I, again, very logical, very science minded. I was like, oh, that's the center of the galaxy. That's where all the things kind of come together. And it's just so bright. And as I sort of looked at it that way, I could see that this was billions and billions, untold amounts of huge suns. Still, each one is so much larger than anything else that we see, but it's just massive. But it is also one thing, right? It's both. It is both one cluster in one place, and it's also tons and tons of smaller little lights. And so that was really amazing and beautiful as well. I just understood, and I knew I wasn't supposed to go into it, even though I really wanted to. I was like, let's just go. Like, can't we just go there too? We've gone to all these other places. Like, let's go into there. And it was just, the answer was just no. There was no real explanation, right? It's just, I could tell. And I've heard other people say they've heard it's not your time. And that was just the feeling of like, no, not now. Right? Like not here, not like this, but yeah, someday maybe, right? But not here. And so there was some disappointment, but it was still just this overwhelming feeling of love, of like, this is beyond all pain or disconnection or fear or anything. If you could be there, you would just be in that love. You would just feel that, just like you would think home feels like or should feel like. And that was probably the best feeling I'd ever had in my entire life up to that point. I had a lot of trauma and a lot of pain. So it was even more sort of tempting to me to just want to stay there or be there. But they just said, it's time for you to go back now. And I was like, okay. No fight from me. Like, this has all been really amazing anyway. And I, again, pretty sure it's a really cool dream. So what do I know? And then they say, you live down here, and they point to the far, far, far end of this hourglass, one half of the hourglass shape, way, way at the end. They're like, that's the Milky Way. That's your home. And then we were just there. We had taken all of this time to leave, to come out, to go past all this beautiful stuff. That was just for my benefit. It was just for me to see all of this and take it in. We could have just been out to that center as quickly as we wanted to, because now we were suddenly just back in the solar system looking at Earth. There was just no time at all. And I was like, oh, wow. That was quick. We went all that distance. They're like, yeah, it's easy. Like, okay. And I looked at Earth, and at first it just looked like Earth, globe, beautiful blue, green ball, clouds and all. And then all of a sudden it had like an overlay over it. And the overlay was like all of these cyclones, all of these spinning sort of vortex looking things. And it looked like if you could look at a tornado from the top down, you would just see the spinning circle, right? And you wouldn't see the whole tube that then comes down from it. And all of those were covering the Earth, and they were side to side, packed together. There was no space for anything but them. There was millions of them, again, uncountable how many there were. And I was like, what is this? And they were like, each one of those is your life, but slightly different, a little different path through your life. And I was like, that's crazy. Like, wow. I was like, am I supposed to go back through one of those? They're like, yeah, you can pick any of them. How would I possibly pick any if there's that many of them?
That is
right?
so wild.
Yeah, I could. It was overwhelming instantly. I was like, I would just go back to the one that you got me from, right? But if I could pick any, like, how would I take the time? How would I know? And then it came to me to ask, could you help me know which one, like is best for me? And they were like, yeah. I was like, oh, okay. Well, then they were like, what do you want? And I said, well, I just want the life that's best for me and for everyone else. And that sounds really simple, right? But I know in that space, the meaning is much more clear than in this space when we have to use words and we have to hope the other person knows what we mean. And everyone could have a different interpretation of a word, but there it's actually not words. The words were, again, for my benefit. We could have just been communicating directly, right? Mind to mind, heart to heart. And that's how they communicate, these ascended masters and higher level beings. And so I didn't know any of that at the time. So I'm just talking and I just said with the one that's best for me and everyone else. But what I meant was the one that is the most loving, the most abundant, the most uplifted for myself and for everyone. And I did not just mean everyone who I know, I meant everyone in the world. And they were like, oh, yeah, that's a good one. That's this one. And as soon as they pointed to it, I just flew. There was no hesitation. They said, that's the one. I drop into this tunnel, this vortex, and I'm just suddenly in a very strange city. It was very futuristic. It was very utopian feeling, or really beautiful feeling. There's nothing negative in it. And I say that each time I tell this story because at that time, and for a long time after, I have a very, very negative view of technology. I have the sort of like Terminator idea in my mind, right? Like that this is the thing that destroys us if we let it. And so to imagine a futuristic city full of technology that isn't destructive to humanity and nature is not something that was in my consciousness at all. To be suddenly in that sort of setting, I was very confused. I was aware that I wasn't physical as well.
Like you
Similar
weren't
to,
embodied at the time?
right. Like that
Okay.
and I could tell that. I could tell that I was in this place, but that I wasn't in a body, and that I was kind of floating around. And my attention was drawn up a building that was like a sort of skyscraper, like a taller glass and metal building. And as my attention was drawn up, I just floated up naturally. And I got to a certain level and I went up to a window and I looked through it and I was making eye contact with a very old woman. And I was like, this is confusing. Why am I staring at this woman? And then, and this is always hard to explain, but as I was myself disembodied, having come back from this experience, I was then also this woman watching myself floating in front of me, realizing that this was the moment that I had seen so many years ago and that I was about to die. And then I died. And then I was just me staring at myself dying as I was old. And then I got whisked back to my present moment in the timeline. I know. I have
goosebumps
too.
Wow.
And it took me a while to even understand that experience because I didn't have out of body in my mind. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know timelines. I didn't know anything. So I just was like, why did I see and then think I was an old person dying? You know, like it was just confusing once I finally was trying to integrate all of this and understand it. But now I look back and understand everything about that moment. And I skipped a large chunk, right? As I'm coming back then from that moment to my present moment in this timeline at that moment, at that time. It's confusing to talk about. As I'm moving back, I'm actually moving backwards through the timeline. So I'm moving backwards through the life that I chose from the point of death to the point where I was taken out to the center of the universe. And so as I'm moving back, there's a huge chunk that I just don't see anything from. Or if I do, I'm not allowed to remember it. And then I start seeing things at 2020 and beyond. So from 2020 back to this is what, 1998 or so, 22 years or so, I just see kind of like rewinding through a VHS tape. If anyone remembers doing that, you just see like a bunch of stuff moving in reverse, but like really clearly there would be like scenes that sort of popped out for a second. And I would just see them for a second and then kind of come back and be reversing really quickly again. And so I have since seen all of those scenes. I have been in them and gone, oh, this is one of the scenes that I had seen. And none of them mattered at all.
Did it feel at all like deja vu? Or is it a
Yes,
distinctly different feeling from deja vu?
it is distinctly different because I knew exactly where it had come from. And a lot of times when I have deja vu, I'm like, I think I dreamt this, or I think I just knew this was going to happen, or it seems really, really familiar because I've been in such a similar situation before. Like there's a couple different types of deja vu, and this was like, oh, this is a scene from that experience. So like similar feeling, just as sort of weird, and also I knew exactly what it was.
And none of them were of much relevance.
None of them mattered at all. They would just be like the silliest moments of just like doing nothing with somebody or like being at a campfire and laughing at something. I mean, they mattered in that. They were
Right.
all
Right.
sort of just fun, normal human moments, but none of them were something to avoid. And none of them were like someone really needed you in that moment or nothing sort of important at all. It was just very normal life moments. So, but every time they happen, I'd be like, well, good. Here I am. I'm still on the right timeline, right?
Right.
um,
Validating.
and eventually I get back and I'm seeing like 2012, 2010, 28, 2000, and then 1990s. And then I plop back into my body. So I literally was like seeing the numbers as I went as well, backwards through the time. And I woke up and I was like, that was the craziest dream I've ever had. That's what I thought for quite a while. But so many other spiritually transformative experiences have reinforced this central experience in various different ways. I've slowly over time started to really, really understand what actually happened in that moment. Nonetheless, in the moment itself, it was transformative just in the least because I saw the universe. How did I just see the whole universe? And I was like fascinated by, is that actually what the universe looks like? Because I didn't know. This is early. There's not a lot of internet. There's not a ton of just space and nebula pictures and things around, or at least not in my world. Then I went about looking to see, is that what things are like? And I found, yeah, they are like that. Not necessarily the figure eight thing. I don't know if that's a concept. Some people have said, oh, yeah, some scientists think that is exactly how the universe is shaped. And I'm like, well, I know it is. So
Yeah.
it makes sense to me. But even that, it was not an idea that I had ever heard of or that I think anyone really ever thought of at that moment in time, right? That wasn't a concept of the universe for at least not in the mainstream.
Well, I think it was interesting that you got to remember certain parts of your backwards life review. And as those moments were seemingly insignificant to the timeline itself, because they were just like those simple little human moments, it's interesting that you got to see those and you got to bring that back with you and then to live it out and to see those things manifest. Do you feel like you were able to bring those back with you so that it would validate to you that your experience was real?
I think that's exactly it. And this is apparently part of the makeup of my astrology. Like when people read my astrology, they're like, how do you ever just believe something? Because I guess like everything about me is geared to doubt 100% of everything that exists.
Skepticism.
Yes.
That's skepticism. That's the word.
Skepticism. I'm the ultimate skeptic. So I believe nothing until it is like deeply proven to me beyond a shadow of a doubt, which means even if I experience it, I go through all the options, right? And that experience too is no different. I was like, that was a crazy dream. And then when I realized it was a bit more than a dream, I was like, well, it was just like a psychic sort of thing. And I went through every option before finally I was like, oh, I was actually taken to the center of the universe. And I actually had this experience and it actually transformed me and changed me and put me on a different timeline. And all these things are true. That's exactly why I had those sorts of moments. It was like, look, see, it's happening again. This was not an accident. You didn't make it up. It was a delusion, right? And here's another moment where you can see for sure that this is true and what actually happened. I also always thought to myself, well, then why is this just missing after 2020? Why do I have nothing after that point? And it's interesting because I've asked the same question of like, why didn't I see anything that mattered? Like, why didn't I see anything that could have helped me prevent me from making big mistakes, which I've made plenty of, right? Or prevent me from getting into really dangerous situations, which I've had plenty of. Why didn't I see those? And the answer for both is the same. And it was like, well, you might not have done it otherwise, right? Like you might not have followed exactly your gut or done exactly what you dream or right you wouldn't
Yes.
have because those things are terrifying. You don't want to do those things. And apparently this period of my life I was similar. I maybe wouldn't have chosen to come this far.
So, at what point did you actually start to believe that this experience was real and not just a figment of your imagination?
It was pretty quickly after it, to be honest. And I don't remember exactly, a couple weeks, couple months, but I was pretty focused on it. It was, again, as skeptical as I was, and as much other things were going on in my life at that time that were deeply traumatizing, and I was in deep trauma, it was just front and center. Every time I had just even a moment, I would go right back to it and be like, what? was that? So, I'd had a lot of crazy dreams. I'm a dreamer. It's one of my spiritual skills that I just didn't understand for many years. And now I use it all the time. But this was so different from any of those dreams, all different kinds of dreams. This was so much beyond them. So I was like, there's something else. So I went once to the library, like within a couple weeks again, or like months or something, very close to the event itself. And I just found what I could on space. I was like, I need to know more about space and see, what was going on. And I found this VHS Nova episode of Nova, and I wish I remembered what it was called, but it was something about the universe. And I brought it home and I was watching it and I put it in, and I was seeing exactly the same things. Now I knew too that they had shown me very specific nebula and galaxies on our way out, so that when I went to watch this, I would be like, that's the exact same one. I was right there. I was watching this and it was blowing my mind. And I was like, wow, I didn't make any of that up. This is all actually how it looks out there. And this is crazy. And then I thought to myself, could it have been not just a dream, and that I actually somehow did travel out to those spaces? And when I thought this, as soon as I thought it, there was an explosion of electricity right in front of my face, like out of nothing caused it. Nothing perceivable caused it, but there was just like a little spark, as though someone like turned a sparkler on and then off again in just a moment. It was just like, psh. And I was like, whoa. And it was exactly as I thought that. And again, it's like sometimes my guides, I think, are just screaming at me. They're like, of course you were taken. What do you mean? Was that real? Well, let's make this little spark happen right in front of you so you cannot deny it because you're awake right now, right? And that blew my mind. I was like, well, what is reality then? Like, what is all of this if you can just take me and I can come back to a different timeline and a spark can just occur out of nowhere and nothing right in front of my face? What is all of this? It was a bit much for my 16-year-old self to deal with. And I had nothing and no one around me who thought about things like this or cared about it or wanted to talk about it. So it was hard.
Did you try to tell anyone?
I did, but they were like, well, that's a crazy dream. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't think it's a dream. And they're like, well, that's crazy.
Oh,
So
yeah.
like they're just not, it's not where they're at, and they just couldn't. And I think part of them too was like, well, even if it wasn't, what would it matter? Like my life is hard too. That all of the people I surrounded myself with at that time were like equally and deeply as traumatized as I was. So we were just survival mode most of the time. And so I think it was also just too much for them. I don't think that was in their capacity to start to deal with.
That must have made you feel really alone.
Very lonely. And what I feel like was already a pretty lonely space to be, when you're just in
Yeah.
trauma and trauma bonded with other people, like there's not a lot of real deep connection there. And so, yeah, it felt even more alienating. And then I just started having nonstop experiences throughout the rest of time. And so I just got sort of lonelier and lonelier. There was just no people. I'm not even sure at what point in my life I finally started to meet people who thought about spiritual things or talked about this sort of stuff.
That's what
Yeah.
I was going to ask you next, was at what point in your life did you start meeting people?
Maybe like 8 years ago. I mean, like not,
Mhm.
there's not many. And it's not like I could hide that I'm more and more and more spiritual as time goes on, because I just am. I can't even stop it. This is the life I came back to, right? And these are the experiences I have nonstop. If somebody's asking you for advice, I'm like, well, your soul is that. And they're like, oh, what? People around me knew, but they just didn't have the same sort of level of understanding or intensity about it. And then, yeah, maybe like 8 years ago, I finally started to meet people who were really more into it. And before that, if I just met people who would just accept it about me, like just accept that I have these experiences and that I feel this way and that this is what I know to be true about reality and our soul, that was enough for me. I was like, oh, thank God. I can just at least just sort of be myself, right? But then once I found people who also have similar beliefs and experiences, it just felt like a new level of sort of coming home and like, thank God there's other people who feel this way. And now it seems like it's everywhere all the time. And I don't know if that's just me. That's sort of part of the mass awakening that's happening and the magic of the internet to allow people to see it happening all over the place all the time, or if I'm just drawing it to me more and more, or it's probably a little bit of both.
Yeah, I imagine it's a little bit of both. The gray area there. We always think in black and white, either or, it's this or this, but it's
Right.
both probably. What I can relate to about that is when I was younger, I had a really hard time connecting with people in my early 20s. And it wasn't until I let go of certain societal expectations and started embracing more of who I am authentically that I started connecting with people that were like-minded with me.
Mm.
And so that makes me curious about your experiences. Can you reflect and recognize a point where you had healed some trauma and started stepping into who you authentically are, and then you started meeting people that were more like-minded?
I mean, that was true all along, but that never stopped happening. It started happening at that moment and it never stopped happening. I can't really express enough how dark my life was at that moment. I mean, I was hanging out with murderers and I was doing really heavy drugs all the time. Yeah, it was really dark. So the process of becoming more authentic in that place and then removing those people from my life, and then the next level of people up is better, it's higher level, it's clearer, it's purer, still not good. So then like growing through that and letting those people go, right? And then healing more, and then new people, better, best yet, still not great. Right? And then
Mm-hmm.
like even more authentic, even more healed, better, pretty good, not ideal. Each level better and better and better until finally I get to a point in my life where I'm like, oh, I am like much more even radically authentic than I ever have been. I wouldn't have even allowed myself to imagine being this way when I was back in that deep of darkness. I couldn't have imagined it. I would have just said, that's not me at all, right? And then at that point, it's like, okay, yeah, I am healed now, and I do get to be my full true self now. I'll say though, there's a different level of loneliness there. And I think this is reflected in a lot of different spiritual traditions and paths. Is like you really do walk it alone. The people around you are the best people you've ever had. They're not going to get better than this. And still, there's this, maybe it's not a problem, but nobody will ever know exactly what I mean when I say anything, right? Well, you have a very good idea, perhaps. And the closer we get, the better idea you get. But really, you're seeing everything through your view. Everybody who's listening to this is getting it through their view. Nobody's actually just seeing perfectly me. Only God can do that, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there's something even lonelier, but also more beautiful and not sad. It's not a loneliness that's empty, right? It's more like solitude, and it's perfect. It's okay, actually. And then you're sort of in a place too where you see, well, now I can give the best that I can to others of really seeing them or really hearing them. And that's like the most beautiful thing, heart to heart, right? That's the most healing thing. Almost no one's doing it. So almost no one's healed enough to just be that for someone and let go of all of their filters and all of their stuff, right? And I think that's part of the goal of spiritual awakening, is becoming so pure and so healed that you can just be present for other people.
I find that very inspiring because I have got to the point in my spiritual journey that I'm used to talking to people and having conversations like this that are producing inspiring content for other people. And so I'm used to inspiring other people. And when I get together and I have a heart to heart with somebody, I'm often sharing my perspectives and my beliefs. And, I have feedback from people in my life being like, I really enjoyed that conversation. It was very thought provoking. I was inspired to do this and this afterwards. I have that like feedback loop, but I don't as much intentionally listen in
Mm.
order to be that, what you're speaking of, for somebody else. I mean, I do listen, it is
Yeah.
like, I do feel like we're having valuable conversations. It's not just like one sided and I'm just
Mm.
throwing information at people, but I think it would be very beneficial for me specifically
Mm.
to intentionally practice more of that.
Yeah, I think for everyone, right?
Right.
Even as far, and then even as far as you get down that road where you're like, oh, I'm really good at this now, you could probably be even better, right? There's probably still
Yeah.
stuff that's sort of ego, and ego is not a bad thing, right? Just those lenses, just those biases, just those experiences where we're still just filtering it through ourselves instead of just really being with that person. That's pure empathy. I mean, that's rough, actually. it costs a lot unless you are very healed, actually, right?
Right.
And I think too, a lot of people, we don't always realize how healed or unhealed we are. A lot of people who I work with will say to me things like, "Oh, I don't really have trauma, so I'm not really concerned about that." And then I'm like, "Okay, I'll take your word for it," right? There's some people who don't have trauma. Somewhere in me, I actually really don't believe that, but like, I'm willing to believe you, right? This is your experience. And then eventually they'll say something like, but my mom, when she left when I was 3, and then my dad died at 5. And I'm like, wait, you think you don't have trauma? But this is sort of where we are always doing this. We're almost always saying like, well, it's not as bad as some other people, so it's not that bad. And I had good people and I made it through and I had enough. And we're always sort of bargaining with ourselves like, oh, it's not that bad. Yeah, no, that is that bad. And it doesn't have to even be that extreme for it to be trauma. There's a million little traumas. So I'm not trying to convince everyone to creating traumas for themselves, but also to be aware that unless you are in constant communion with your highest self and in constant kind of reception of all of the sort of psychic energies around us and really deep grounded awareness of self and centered being, you're probably not healed. And it's not to say there's anything wrong with that. If I look at the spiritual path as a path of healing, there is no difference to me between opening your spiritual channel and healing. They're the same thing, actually. And until we're this floating ball of light in the Merkaba, like we're not fully healed. So there's something left, right? There's something in you that's still stagnant or dark or disconnected, needs to be brought into the whole, reunited, reintegrated, or else you wouldn't be here.
Right. And you said stagnant or dark. And the word dark made me think of shadow work, right? Yeah. It's what is hiding in the shadows, which is what we're all afraid of back when we were children. And we don't even have reasons really to be afraid of the dark. We simply are. It's uncomfortable. And that's ultimately what leads people to create these survival strategies and narratives about like, oh, I don't have trauma. It's that avoidance. From my experience, the more that I looked at the things in the shadows, the more my life made sense.
Yeah.
If you're getting any value out of this podcast, please hit that like button and subscribe. Also, if you've enjoyed my content before, or maybe you're new here, but you like it, drop a comment and let me know you're here. I would love to get to know my audience. Thank you for listening, and let's get back to the content. I literally simply just can't imagine not doing those things, not looking at the stuff that was ugly in the dark spaces inside, because it was in doing that that put me on the trajectory to finding my purpose.
Yeah.
And so I feel like the more we avoid the shadow work, the more that we choose to look at surface level things, we're putting off the parts of our experience that are going to be the most profoundly joyful and make the largest impact on who we are currently and who we become.
Yeah. No, it's beautifully said. And it's so true. And I'm similar. At the same time, sometimes I find myself going, oh, I didn't even know I had a shadow there to look for, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know what we don't know. And so intentionally doing shadow work can go so far, but some of it just has to come over time too, right? And we kind of stumble upon it and we're like, oh, this too. Okay, yeah, right. I recently was recognizing I had criticized before this fear mentality that will drive people to react, and especially to suddenly take medications or suddenly do a sort of route of allopathic healing, that I'm like, oh, but you could use natural ways and you could like find this other route and it could be more healing and sustaining. And so I had criticized that in the past. And then I found myself doing the same thing and I didn't even notice it. And like a year went by and then I saw it and I was like, oh, I actually took this medicine that I didn't need to do. I could have done a natural route. And I even knew it at the time. And people at the time were even telling me, why won't you do the natural route? And I was like, because I'm too sick for that. I'm too sick for that. I have to do this other route or else things could go really wrong. And I was acting out of fear when I was choosing this path that I had also criticized. So I saw my own hypocrisy, right? And I was like, wow, what a hypocrite I am. And then that hurt to see myself in that light, right? Like, I'm a hypocrite. I hate hypocrites. But this is the thing, like, I didn't see it in the moment because I was afraid. I knew I was afraid and I still thought I was doing the right thing. I convinced myself of that. I was reactionary. And then I was delusional about it. I didn't think that was hypocritical at all, right? Until I finally saw it. And I saw it because I was finally well enough and far enough from the fear that I wasn't attached anymore. And I was like, oh, yeah, I literally did the exact same thing that I had criticized. So, we can say all the things we want. We can do all the healing we want. We can be as advanced in many ways and then still be like really slow in other ways. Like, it's not a straight linear path. This is the other thing. I like to share things like that because I think people imagine, because of the work I do, and I'm like able to communicate with my guides and allies, and I'm able to help other people communicate with theirs. And I, get messages and I teach and I guide and I'm a healer and all these things. And I think they imagine then that, oh, I must be like perfect or something. No, no, I'm doing the best I can. I have my eye towards always getting better, but I'm going to make mistakes. Right. And part of that, I think that is helpful, or was helpful for me when I was sort of coming up through my own path, to see that, to realize like, it isn't about being perfect. It's about being always intent on what can I do better? Like, how can I improve more? And how can I love myself enough to allow the shadow to come forward? And to really see it and accept it. Yep, I also can be a hypocrite.
Yeah, we all can.
And I think also it's important because we can have these people who will idolize them. We're like, oh, that person, they get it. They see it. They're doing it. I love them. I want to be like them. And then they do something like that. And we're like, everything shatters. How could you hurt me like this? How could you lie to me? And it's like, they weren't. And actually, just because someone makes a mistake like that doesn't mean the rest of what they have said and done is worthless, right? And this is also a really valuable lesson in that, because I do that too. I'm like, that person, they're so great. And then they fail at something and I'm like, cast them aside. No, don't cast them aside. Keep all of the things that are good, true, and beautiful about them and forgive them their errors, just like you hope to be forgiven yourself.
Yeah, that reminds me of the expression, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah, exactly. Something's still valuable there. Don't throw it all away.
So when I was younger, I actually embarked on my journey of self-discovery. I was very young, actually, and it was prompted by trauma. As I was growing older and I was continuing this journey, I had recognized in my early 20s that I was not able to allow myself time within this healing journey to just rest and enjoy the benefit of the work that I had put in, to the point in which I was creating problems so that I could work on them. So that is an interesting facet of the shadow work journey, is also recognizing that you don't always have to be doing the shadow work. There's a point in that healing journey, many points along that journey, that is happy and calm and peaceful, and you can just sit and rest in the work that you have done and appreciate life. Yeah. And that's something that I had to learn the hard way.
I love it because it's so true and there's no rush.
Right.
I mean, we've been at this for how many lifetimes? Like, it's all good. We can just calm down for a little bit and relax. And yeah, I know that it almost gets, I can't think of the word right now, but
addicting.
Yeah, that's not the word I'm looking for, but yes, that definitely addicting. And it's this constant seeking out more issues, more problems. What else can I heal? Keep going, keep going. And it's like, yeah, but how much comes together in the moments where you put it all down and release, right? Yeah. I see this a lot of times that people will come to me and we'll be doing some healing work, and so much comes together for them in that moment. And I'm kind of overwhelmed. I'm like, wow, but I always recognize like, this is actually because you have already done so much. And it's just sort of like crystallizing in this moment, actually. And so I hope you take a big break. Like, I hope you just sit and congratulate yourself. Look at all the things that you've accomplished. Like, take stock of your achievements and how far you've come. and really luxuriate in them, because maybe that will sort of be the ticket that slows you down a bit on this. We don't have to rush through it. And if there, you get to a point where you're not going to make any more progress right now, like it's just time to just be. And sometimes for some people, I think that then feels stuck or stagnant. They're like, but nothing's happening. It's not moving forward. It's like, it's not supposed to. And it's so funny. I'm actually in like a 6-year version of this right now. Because, part of my trauma response was overactivity, higher achieving, like nonstop, like just keep going, 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 like get the degrees and get the houses and sell the houses and make the money and all this stuff. And then I just stopped one day and I sold everything and I got in a van and I drove around the continent. It was so good. But I was also like, okay, well, I did it. I drove around the continent and now I'm going to keep going. And life was basically like, no, you're not. No, you're not. You're going to stay right here. This is the longest I've ever been in one house. I've been here 5 years. I've never been in a house longer than that. It's the longest I've been at one, I'll say career path at this point, because it's a job I gave myself, but it's the longest I've ever done that. All of these things that I thought I would have like gone on from here to do, like not even a shadow of them has begun to creep into the scene, like nothing. And I keep asking my guides, am I supposed to just keep in this holding pattern? And they're like, yeah, you'll know when you're not. I'm like, okay, but now it's been 5 years. Like, am I supposed to still just keep staying here and doing this? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, wow. And it's really good for me. I can't even begin to describe how many things have come together, like how many things have done that sort of crystallizing process, how much I've sort of just been able to finally look back and reflect and understand even more deeply how these cycles have gone over the course of my life and how I've gotten to where I am and who I actually am. And you think you know all these things, you think you've got it, and then something like this happens where you are just sitting and just not moving, right? Stewing in it, and you really start to see it clearer than ever. So it's almost indescribable, but I'm so glad you said that, because it is so vital that we just stop sometimes and do nothing.
Well, and I feel like the stillness gives life to the clarity. And that's why we meditate,
Yeah.
you know? I want to get back to your story. Were you brought up in any sort of religious household?
I had some Lutheran background, and it was very clear that it wasn't a powerful belief. So it wasn't necessary for me to commit to believing a certain thing. But the idea that God could be real and that there may have been a Jesus, that was like acceptable. Again, it was pretty obvious we went to church because it was just a thing we did. There was no push or anything to believe a certain thing about it. So I felt really happy at church. I felt like this was actually one of the only places and times in my life where everything was just clean and happy and good. So I loved church, but it was not because of a very specific spiritual connection. However, one of my main activities was to wander through fields and forests by myself from like the age of 5 onward and just talk. And I would just be talking to nobody, but I would be receiving ideas and information and answers back. And I just didn't question it. And it wasn't an imaginary friend. I didn't like personify it. It wasn't very clear. It was just conversation that was happening. And I look back and I'm like, those are my guides talking to me even back then, right? I just was a kid. It was innocent. I was just talking and I would just know things and then I would just understand it. And people around me would be like, how did you know that? And I'd be like, isn't it obvious? Isn't that just what the truth is? And they were just kind of like, I don't know any 5-year-old that knows those things, but I was just hearing and understanding and probably getting what people are calling downloads. And eventually I had an imaginary friend, but it was because people prompted me. They were like, do you have imaginary friends? And I was like, what's that? And they're like, oh, it's like not real and they're people and they can be anyone. And I was like, oh, well then, yeah. And so I like made a bunch up because I was just fun. But some of those have stayed as guides in my life. So I almost feel like I just gave some of my guides, or rather in that moment where I was like, yeah, what could it be? They were like, well, I'm here. Right. And I was like, yeah, there's one that looks like this and there's one that looks like that. And they were all just adult humans. Like they weren't like fantastical or fanciful at all. Yeah, one of them still comes today. She was a doctor back then and she's still like my medical guide, and she will give me advice on what to eat and what not to eat and what to take and how much of it. And she's still a doctor. So that was sort of my spiritual background. I didn't think of it as spiritual and it wasn't very specific. And it was definitely not a part of any like specific culture or tradition.
And so you mentioned that you do work in the spiritual space. When did that begin? Did you have career paths and other avenues, or have you just always been in the spiritual space?
I'll say I've always been in the spiritual space, but I didn't necessarily think of it exactly like that. And I started doing tarot also around the same time that this experience occurred.
When you were a
Uh,
teenager?
yeah, when I was a young teenager, and some part of me then had to face that there was spiritual things going on with that, but I didn't necessarily pick it up as a spiritual tool. I just picked it up as like a weird party trick. And that's what it was. So that had all sorts of different ramifications. And it actually caused me to stop doing tarot for many years. I now do tarot again in a much healthier way, I'll say. But I always knew that I would need to only help and not hurt. And that there were almost no jobs that did that, in my opinion, because of the way the world was. Like, if it serves in any way military or war machines, like, I can't be connected to that. If it's in any way preying on poor people, I can't be a part of that. Like, and so it's just reducing what I could do as a career to a very few things. And they seemed to be, to me, either in the medical field or the teaching field. And those were the only jobs I could think of that did no harm and that only helped, or that's what I thought at the time. And I knew I couldn't be medical because I couldn't deal with people's fluids and things, right? That was not my style. So teacher it was. And then I was sort of really directly called to that path as well through some very specific experiences. As a teacher, it was always my intention and understanding that this was a sacred duty. And I looked at it as such. And it's not just a job, and it's not just a thing I learned how to do. And I'm like doing this to save souls. And I saw, again, in my exceptionally traumatic childhood, that teachers who loved me were everything. They made all the difference. They're the reason that I was able to survive all of this. And so I knew that I could also be that. And then I also saw the opposite. I saw the teachers who were horrible, who were abusive, right? Who got into this for unknowingly, I'm sure most of them, but pretty dark reasons. And they were harmful to kids. And if I hadn't had the good teachers and had only had those, I definitely wouldn't have made it. So, I wanted to be one more teacher who could call people to their highest selves in some way, even though that's not actually what we're supposed to be doing as teachers. I'm sneaking it in. I'm doing the emotional, right, support and loving kids the best I can, and also be one less teacher that is abusive or harmful in some way. So, it was spiritual for me. I got to a point in life where I recognized it's not spiritual enough. It's not actually what I'm supposed to be doing.
So after you had that realization, did you make a career change?
Yep, that's when I got in the van and drove around.
Oh,
Yeah.
right. So
Yep.
after you had returned, now you are in, did you say you've been there for 5 years where you are currently?
Yeah. Yep.
What have you been doing since you parked the van?
Again, I had been doing tarot for a while, but not professionally, not as an offer to the public, just for friends, and I had been doing, I'll say, sort of healing and spiritual work with people, but again, not as a profession. People just knew me as that. So they'd come to me for things and they'd know that I could just help, and I just would. And so, I had sort of been slowly taught all sorts of skills throughout my life. I very accidentally end up in the laps of shamans around the world, and then they teach me things while healing me. And it was as though I had been being prepared all along. And so when I sort of landed here, I had to fight myself to not go back to teaching. Like, I had to make myself not go back to teaching, because that was the easy and the known and the reliable and the dependable. But I knew that I was supposed to be offering tarot to people and offering healing to people and offering things to people, but I just didn't know what that would look like, or how it could happen, or how it was going to start to come together. But I just did. I was like, okay, well, now I offer tarot. So if you want to do a tarot reading, here I am. During this time, because I had kind of put everything down and opened up this space, my guides were much more able to be like, okay, now do this. And they'd be like, yeah, now you need to do ceremonies for people. And I'm like, what's ceremonies for people? And they would just show me and teach me. And I would, oh, okay. And it's a little bit from this shaman and this little bit from that tradition and this other person who taught you that. And it's all of that sort of, but it's your way of healing. I'm like, oh, I can do that. They're like, yeah, that's what you're here for. I'm like, oh, okay. So then I would just offer it. I'd be like, okay, well, now I do this. And people would just start doing it. And I'd get to see how transformative it was for them. I think for some people that can be like, wow, look at me, look how powerful I am. But for me, it was like, oh God, am I really supposed to be taking this much responsibility? Like me? Are you sure? I just didn't really want it in a way. It was too big. But I just kept doing it anyway because I kept being told to. And I have learned over the years to listen and to do what I'm told. And it has worked out beautifully. And I've been able to heal so much of myself, some of my self-doubt, some of my lack of confidence, some of my remaining lack of self-love. You know, all of these things have deepened in me as other people have been able to receive also from me. And so the healing goes both ways, right? And then those people are then more able to step into their role, because I haven't met a person yet who couldn't be a healer. And so they get to, and not that everyone has to do it in the same way. There's a million ways, right? Just being yourself is one really beautiful way, but people get to step more into their truest, most authentic self. And that's what I'm doing too. So, you know, it just moved that way sort of naturally. And I say sometimes like against my will. It wasn't really against my will. It's just like I kind of had to be dragged into it.
On a personal level, I'm very interested in your road trip because
Yeah.
I actually had done something similar. I threw all my stuff in a storage unit, broke up with my boyfriend, moved into a minivan. It wasn't even like a glorious camper van. I sold my really nice Toyota hybrid sedan for this like old van. Anyway, and I set it up with what I thought were my essentials. And I didn't even think about convenience at all. I just like threw everything in totes and was just like, I need to go. My soul is calling me out on a journey. And it was the best thing I ever did.
Yeah.
Because I, as corny as it can sound, found myself.
Yeah.
I had learned what it felt like to be connected to my higher self or centered. I discovered what my peace looks like and what it feels like to consistently rest in that and to navigate and trusting in that flow, that feminine flow of experience, because without that structure, you know, without that routine, everything being completely different, and just trusting the flow of experience of life was so amazing and life-changing for me.
Yeah.
How long were you out?
Oh, it was only a few months. It was supposed to be a year, but it just didn't go that way in a beautiful way. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. But in my head, I was like, I'm at least a year in this van. And very similar. I was like, I sold everything. I sold my nice car and everything. And I just got this old chunky Ford E150 or E350 or whatever, some van. And it was filthy. And I had to like rip things out and like steam clean it and everything. And I actually had my friend build like a platform. My queen mattress could fit in there. So it's mostly a queen mattress and then a little bit of storage. And like, that's it. Camping stove and everything. But yeah, it was very similar. And as I went, you know, and traditionally when I'm on a vacation or I'm visiting somewhere, like I'm doing everything. I'm like, I want to go to this landmark. I want to do this hike. I'm going to go out. I'm like, blah. And this was very much like just drive and stop somewhere and throw up the hammock and fall asleep for 3 hours and then maybe eat something and then maybe go for a swim and then sleep some more and then sleep all night and then drive somewhere else and just wandering, much like what you described. And yeah, it's a really good description too, to just trust that flow and to not need to control any of it. I didn't have plans. I just went. I had a vague idea of what I hoped to do, but I was just not committed to it. And that's very abnormal for me too. I'm very plan. Everything's organized. And this was just go and just be. And some parts of it were very terrifying. But I still, even in those moments, was learning I don't have to be worried about that at all. And this isn't the same as just throwing yourself into danger and, you know, hoping that God creates like bulletproof vests around you. Like, no, I'm just saying there were some aspects that could have deterred me if I let fear be my motivator instead of just saying like, no, I'm guided to go here. And so I'm going to trust that it's going to be okay. One of these moments, I was up in the Yukon in Canada. I had wandered that far and I was up there, and my aunt texted me and she said that there's somebody in this area of Canada that's killing people in vans. And I looked at the area and it was exactly where I was. And then the reception went out and there was no more reception because the Yukon is remote.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So I was like, wait, what? And I was like, well, I guess I'll just keep going because where I just came from is 3 hours of nothing. So if I turn around, I'm like 3 hours of nothing. There's no telephone poles, there's no driveways, there's no stores. It's just a road through the forest and there's nothing there. Almost no cars passing. And I'm like, but if I keep going, I'm like an hour from at least a campsite I'm going to in this beautiful hot spring that I'm so excited to get to. And so I was like, so I think I'll just go and hopefully I won't be murdered in my van by whatever this is. So I'm going, I'm like, okay, I can't text her back. I can't get more information on this. I'm just going to keep going forward. And then this rainstorm starts. And I've been in rainstorms my whole life. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. There's nothing but rain. Much of it is stormy. I've seen really heavy torrential. I have never seen anything like this. I couldn't see at all. Zero visibility because so much water was coming down my windshield. I couldn't see the road in front of me. I would have had to open the door to see the road beside me. But if I did, there would have just been buckets of water dumping inside. And so I was just hoping that I was still on the road. Part of me was like, you should just stop driving. But another part of me was like, don't stop driving. Because if anything does come from behind you, you'll be hoping to go a little bit faster so that like nobody hits you because no one can see anything. And so I'm like, just keep going. You saw the road before the rain started. It was very straight. Like just so I'm driving blind. The reception has gone out. I think there's a killer. Finally, the rain just like lets up just enough that I can see a little bit of the road in front of me. So now I'm just bare knuckling it, hoping that this lets up at some point. This goes on because what should have been an hour was now like a 3-hour drive because of how horrible the visibility was. I finally get to my hot spring and somehow I had miscalculated. It was one of the only reservations I made because you have to at this place. It's just like, you know, people come from all around the world and you have to have your spot. And I had miscalculated and I was there a day early. And I was like, you can't send me out there. There's a murderer out there. Like, and the lady's like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, you haven't heard there's a murder? And she's like, oh, that's not going to matter. I heard about that. How is she so casual about this person murdering people? I don't know what to do. Can I just park somewhere? And she's like, well, there's a parking lot across the street. And I was like, I can't just park in a parking lot when there's a murderer. And she's just like, no, there's other people in the parking lot too. They're also going to be staying there because truckers would pull into this parking lot, I guess, just to park. And okay, it's going to be okay. That's safe. There's people around. And so I did. I just stayed there and nobody died. I mean, whoever died was already dead, but nobody else died. And I obviously wasn't murdered and the storm passed and everything was okay. And that hot spring was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life. So also there was this massive payoff for it. But all sorts of aspects of that trip were the same, in which I would come up against something that was like, well, I can respond in fear and I could go back, or I could give up, or I could just trust that I'm supposed to go forward. And sometimes it was like an intense change of plan. I was supposed to go up to Alaska and all through Alaska, but at the last minute, I just really felt like I'm not supposed to do that. I'm supposed to actually start heading back down now. And I did. And I gave up some of what I thought was going to be some of the most beautiful experiences of my life in Alaska to do that. But then I found other incredible, beautiful experiences that I wouldn't have found otherwise, right? So I also had this sort of peace like you were describing. And part of that trust, though, was that you don't have to have a plan. And if you do have a plan, you don't have to stick to it. And you can just be like loose and flexible in everything in life. It doesn't have to be just the way you approach people, or it can be all of life that is like this. And that was brand new for me. So that was really beautiful.
I definitely experienced a lot of similar reflections about fear being a construct of the mind. And I had multiple times where I was prompted through my intuition, spiritually, prompted to GTFO, certain spots that I was at. And based on me experiencing those promptings that were protecting me, I knew that if I was in danger at all, that I would receive warning.
Yes. Yep, that's part of the trust.
Yeah, exactly. And so knowing that gave me peace of mind in so many other scenarios that I was in that could have been dangerous or made me feel slightly exposed or uncomfortable. That was such a wonderful exercise for learning trust.
Yeah. Well, and learning how your spiritual compass works, or your spiritual pendulum, or your spiritual channel, right? To understand like, oh, this is how I receive messages, and this is how I will be told or shown things. And, you know, I think some people say, well, then why wasn't I warned before I had this horrible thing happen to me? And I'm going to say I would challenge anyone to look at the times where something bad has happened and to really look deep. And I bet you'll see the warning signs you didn't pick up in the moment. And I bet you'll be able to identify what it was that blocked you from trusting the warning signs that were trying to tell you.
Another angle to look at that is look at those traumatic situations, so those things that you endured, and reflect on the positive things that have come from it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people think that certain experiences should be labeled as good or bad.
Yeah.
And some of the worst things that happen to us are the best things for our growth and are required of our experience in order to step into our purpose.
Absolutely. Absolutely true. You know, I talk about it as the purpose of darkness or a darkness of purpose. And no matter what we could point to, there's something that it serves. And in fact, it all serves the light or whatever we're calling the light or the good, right? It actually all feeds into that. And, you know, even when we look at it in nature or biologically, right? There's maggots and these things that we're like, ew, it's gross. But actually, without them, there would just be dead carcasses everywhere. They would never break down or degrade. Parasites, even, they're actually eating up toxins. They're actually accomplishing something. And it's hard because we're not that thing. But if we were able to look from that thing's point of view, like it's doing a very important job. Like it has to be done, actually. And yeah, those experiences that are painful for us, the way that I've sort of seen it and received messages around it is that the pain is usually the transformation that's occurring. It's a change that's taking place, or it's our resistance to it. So when we're really holding on and we're like, no, it's not going to be like that hurts. We're creating trauma for ourselves, or we're learning how to transcend something, release something, or again, develop some sort of gift that we then get to share with others. It all serves the good eventually.
Right, right. The awakening is through the adversity.
Yeah, the way I experience it is the blockage is where we've stored the things that we have refused to accept in ourselves up until now. So it's the same sort of idea. Because the way we sometimes view what feels like blockage or what feels like stagnancy or what feels like us being held back or us being tortured, we usually view it as like a punishment. Why is this happening to me? Why do I have to do this? But this is actually the place where, again, you're the one who stored this energy here. Some other life, some other place, some other time, you were like, nope, not dealing with that. And now here it is. And now you're going to deal with it. And actually, as you, I think, said earlier in this discussion, like when you then look at it and accept it, it's actually so much easier than you think. It's just the shadow. You just have to look at it and go, yep, that is true. That hurt. That felt bad. Or, yep, I was a hypocrite. Or, yeah, I did really make a huge mistake there, right? Or I didn't understand this thing. And now I do. And on the other side is always a new layer of ourself that we get to experience. You know, we call it integration. It's really just like, oh, this is me too. Yeah, I'm this person. I've actually always been this person. I was just kind of suppressed. I just didn't know.
Lean into the discomfort. The discomfort is an opportunity. It is there to teach you something that's going to help you navigate. We as humans, we have this knee-jerk reaction to avoid discomfort. But recognizing discomfort as an opportunity makes it so much easier to observe it and to be productive with your observation, be able to learn from it, and, as you said, integrate it.
Yeah. And I think part of that is letting go, that detachment from things. That's like a superpower in itself. I call it surrender. And as I say, surrender is a superpower. It doesn't mean allowing bad things to happen to you, right? It's not that kind of surrender. That's what people usually think of. They're like, why would I ever surrender? It's like, no, that's not the type of surrender. But in the midst of the pain or the discomfort or the thing that you think is bad, when you do let go and surrender, that source flow is able to come through. And again, that observation that you mentioned comes in. You're able to see like, oh, this is what's actually going on right now. And you have more ability to have a transformative experience instead of a negative experience, if we want to use those words. A small example, you know, if you were to go take a cold shower, but some part of you might be like, this is horrible. Why is this happening? Oh my God. And you like clench up and you start shivering. And that's actually you're shutting down now and your body's going into shock and you're creating trauma for yourself. But you could just as easily, actually, maybe more easily, just not clench and just breathe just keep the breath moving in and out. And now you're having a cold shower and you're not shivering and you're not clenched up and you're not like shaking and you're not creating a trauma or a stress for your body, but you're in the exact same situation. Just one of them, you've released the attachment to it and you're just experiencing it and observing it. And you're like, yeah, it's cold. It doesn't hurt. It's not harming me. It's cold, right? And the other one, you're like fighting it and fighting it. So again, we have to know like the times where we're not supposed to just like roll over, give up and die. But there's times too where it's like, this is the experience. So just notice it, stop being attached to it and stop clenching into it. When you shut down like that, this flow of energy that is represented by the breath continuing to come in and out is stopped. What could you do when your energy is stopped? Not much.
Absolutely. It's funny you say that because I like 2 days ago actually did a cold plunge.
Oh,
and
nice.
I hated it.
Yeah, it's not comfortable.
No, but even as much as I go around saying lean into the discomfort, I was like, no, this is awful.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit hypocritical too. I'm definitely not perfect.
Well, this is actually a perfect opportunity though to see that, right? Because everyone I think has that same response like, oh, I can't. I'm not saying you're saying this. People say, I can't do that. When I get in, I'm too cold. I shiver too much, or I can't do it. It's like, no, you can do it. You can do it. It takes practice to be continuously breathing and just released while you're feeling all those physical sensations that have been warning signs before to your brain. And to just say, no, it's okay. This time we don't need to be warning about this. And then when you do that, that's like new layer achieved. Like now you're like, oh, I'm someone who can do this thing. I can choose to create my experience in this instead of just reacting and clenching and like, right?
Yeah.
And that's a powerful feeling. As simple as that activity is, that's a really big step, actually. So I encourage anyone out there who's like, I could never, just try it.
I will try it again. And
Yeah.
I'm going to focus more on breath.
Yes. The breath is actually the key. When you're just like, I'm just going to keep breathing. In a second, you realize, oh, I've been cold the whole time I've been breathing and I haven't died.
Or, I haven't died. Yeah. I'm safe. I'm safe. I'm not being harmed. Yes, absolutely. So I have one question that I like to ask everyone to wrap it up. If there was one thing that you could say to the world, if you had a mission statement, what is your purpose in sharing your stories?
Yeah, the one thing that I genuinely hope that every single person could do is to love themselves and to love themselves so radically that all that they could possibly be around are the things that reflect back to them the truth and the goodness and the authenticity of who they actually are in all their shadow, right? And all their glory and all of their upliftment and also all of the times they failed, and just love that to dust and go back to all the times in your life where you didn't love yourself enough and where other people didn't give you the love that you needed and that they probably should have given you, and to love yourself even harder because you didn't receive it from other people, because you're the one who can give yourself that. And when you can do that all the way through your life, right up to this present moment, everything else will follow and will transform. You will be on your highest timeline and you will be in your deepest ability to move forward into your opening of your spiritual channel. Again, the healing is no different from the spiritual progression.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. And thank you so much for taking time out of your day to have this conversation with me. It's been wonderful.
It's been very fun for me too, and beautiful. And I'm grateful to have this conversation with you and your beautiful audience.
Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. If you loved this episode, please consider leaving a review. If you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so we don't lose each other. And to share the link with somebody who can appreciate this message. Blessings to you all, and I hope to catch you on my next episode.